about these maritime disputes is everyone thinks they're historical. So, like even Dokdo, right? What do countries do? What do Japan do and Korea do? They go back into history and they try and find some kind of scroll or map that proves that they claimed it first. And this is genuinely anachronistic. It's genuinely ahistorical, because trying to think about what ancient kings thought about these islands doesn't make any sense, because they didn't think about them. Nobody 500 years ago would have thought a bunch of uninhabited rocks mattered. The only people who cared historically were the fishermen who tried to avoid them. Right? So we can't go back into history. And in fact, they're not historical disputes. They're contemporary disputes based on a very new, meaning the last couple centuries, view of the world, which is this Westphalian view where we have a nation state, and we divide everything up, even out into the water. And when we have a border and we have a passport and everything else. So it's a contemporary dispute as countries are trying to decide, wait a minute, we never cared about this before. Oh, maybe I should care. The other general point I would say is people are usually worried because there are resources underneath them, right? Why do we care about the Spratlys or whatever? There might be potential oil fields, or Dokdo, well, there's a lot of fish around there or something, right? And my point is this: if it's about resources, it's actually not that hard to solve, because you can divide it up. Things, material things, economics is actually pretty fungible. You can say you take 50%, I take 50, or you put up the front end and I'll take the back end. There's a lot of ways you can divide up resources. If it's about something about national integrity and it starts to get claimed that way, which you can't divide, it's about national pride, which Dokdo is clearly not about resources. It's about national pride in Korea. Then it's much harder to solve. And in a way, when you hear these worries about it being resources, that I actually find more encouraging. When you start to hear countries like Vietnam and China claiming it's part of their inalienable sovereignty, then you start thinking we're in trouble. But I will make a couple other points about it, which is, first, that they may have a lot of disputes and skirmishes over this, but I think that when we worry about this leading to actual war, that's a very long way from these countries mobilizing millions of men and fighting a war of extermination against the other side. I mean, that's a long way to go from these things. So there could be many disputes, but I think a lot of the hype about this starting World War III is very exaggerated, precisely because it's not about people and land, it's about a bunch of rocks in the water. So yeah, it matters a little bit. But countries' existences aren't in trouble, so I think that's not going to be that bad. Final point, how do you solve them? That's a big question, right? And obviously, if I had an answer, I would be trumpeting it everywhere. But I will point out that, interestingly enough, how governments and people decide to choose whether to make disputes or not, they can change their mind. And there's plenty of disputes that used to be very important but aren't. And for example, between France and Germany, there was a lot of times when they would claim historically the Alsace-Lorraine. Even between the US and Canada in the 19th century, there were disputes. There's still actually a couple today, actually, where there's some very small islands, right? So countries can decide, do we care about this, do we not? And unfortunately, what that's going to take is that's going to take domestic political courage, not just from the Chinese leadership, but from the Japanese and the Koreans and the Vietnamese, because now it's incredibly convenient for everybody to use it for their own domestic nationalist purposes. You know, Japan's future is really interesting because ever since like the 80s, when I was in college, people have been expecting Japan to burst out of its shell and become a normal nation. And what we mean by normal nation is one like the Western countries with a big army and sort of imposing, jostling to be a leader and all this kind of stuff. And for decades, and even now, we keep talking about Japan is going to be more robust militarily, and Article 9 is in trouble. I'm actually not so sure. The troubles, partly it's because Japan as an economy and as a society is probably not in the high growth era anymore. It's pretty obvious, right? But I don't think it's just material constraints, right? what I see, and a lot of my work recently has been on historical things, is that Japan's domestic institutions, its identity, its domestic culture, is not one which has ever really been deeply engaged in jostling in East Asia. Right? I mean, this is not woven into their national psyche or their institutions or their worldview or anything else. The few times they try, 1592, with a big invasion, and then the colonial experiment of the last century, they fail miserably. In other words, what I see of a Japan is a rich island nation that's influential, that people care about, that interacts with East Asia, but that is not one that inherently is trying to jostle and compete with China for leadership, or really trying to actually even to impose that much on Korea. My view is very different, I think, from the typical one, which expects this titanic competition between Japan and China. But I don't see a whole lot of appetite for that in Japan. I see Japan being a very powerful, strong example on multilateral issues, on humanitarian issues, and being an important but not necessarily a dynamic leader type of country in the region. And so a lot of our questions about how are they going to respond, are they going to rearm, are they, those to my mind are probably less likely than a Japan that remains a strong U.S. ally. They remain quite rich, a strong economy, and then is part of a larger system or region in which it's one of many important players. So I actually see more of the same rather than a big change.